Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week on the show, we're featuring an interview with Dulce, a member of Companeros Inmigrantes en las Montañas en Accion, or CIMA, a local organizing and advocacy group by and for immigrants in Western North Carolina, about her experience working for dignity and solidarity in light of the current and past administrations. More on CIMA can be found at cimawnc.org. Then Ian spoke with Kristian Williams about his most recent book, The Illuminist: Philosophical Explanations in the Work of Alan Moore. The chat touches on Moore's work and its anarchist underpinnings, his legacy in and out of comics, the necessity of imagination, and the possibilities that arise from death and disaster. The book is available from emergencyhearts.com or christianwilliams.com. The book is available from emergencyhearts.com or christianwilliams.com.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Dulce.
Hi everybody, my name is Dulce. I am a part of the team of CIMA, Companeros Inmigrantes de las Montañas en Accion. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm in Asheville.
Could you talk about the work of CIMA, the communities that you operate in and serve, and what the goals of the group are?
Sí. El trabajo de CIMA es mayormente defender los
Yes, the main purpose of CIMA is to fight for the rights of migrant and immigrant people in Western North Carolina. And we do that through advocacy, through fighting against anti-immigrant laws.
También hacemos educación.
We also do a lot of educational programs and workshops for the community. For example, currently we are doing workshops on knowing your rights. And one of the missions and objectives is to have a community that is organized, prepared, and educated. Our vision for the community is that they can take care of one another.
Nosotros mayormente servimos a la comunidad.
The majority of our work is with the Latino community, but we are allies to other immigrant communities and other languages that they may speak.
So recently, this region experienced a terrible disaster after Hurricane Helene came through, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit anecdotally about the experiences during this election season when there was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric nationally, but also regionally, about some of the experiences of Latino immigrants and other people to the disaster, and people feeling safe to access resources or being scapegoated or accused of crimes or what have you in relation to the disaster.
Para la comunidad latina, no se siente seguro.
For the Latino community that we serve, it was a feeling that there wasn't safe places to access the federal support like FEMA. And we actually saw a lot of ways that the community couldn't access resources that came after the hurricane.
There were also rumors spread around this time, for instance, in unrelated to the disaster in Springfield, Ohio, of members of the Haitian immigrant community. Around the same time as the storm hit, there were rumors in Western North Carolina of looting or of people stealing or whatever that were often framed in a racial manner that seemed like they would also make communities feel less safe around their neighbors and not just around authorities. Could you speak to this, or even being able to access survival needs from places like nearby churches or community groups?
Creo que la retórica anti-inmigrante.
I believe that the anti-immigrant rhetoric has grown not only during the times of the hurricane, but from before the hurricane.
Esparcido contra nuestra comunidad desde antes.
But what I can say is that during the time of the hurricane, in certain communities, for example in Emma, there was a lot of solidarity from people to people. And of course, there was churches and other groups that were able to provide support and that were born in this time. But again, the support was from people to people and not from the government.
De la gente de los pueblos para los vecinos y creamos como una familia grande. De hecho, aquí en EMA, en el mercado comunitario,
And in fact, in Emma, when the free market was born from the hurricane, which is our mutual aid project, we met Haitian, Russian, Ukrainian, and even white people from our community. And I believe that that solidarity and mutual aid lessened the anti-immigrant ideas or the ideas that immigrants are criminals because they were able to meet us and we all were able to benefit from the resources that came.
The Trump administration has promised for a long time and is showing signs of starting to push through a very strong anti-immigrant agenda of supporting and forcing federal law enforcement to seek people who were not born in the United States or who don't have permanent status in a way that's often going to be racialized policing. Could you talk a bit about how you're feeling right now and what you're hearing from the community in terms of the dangers of what appears to be happening now?
Claro. En este caso,
Of course, in this case, our community in particular is a lot more vulnerable in many different aspects.
todas las leyes que está
All of
firmando
these
son
laws that are being signed,
herramientas como la
like HR 29, HR 30, are laws that we've seen as anti-immigrant laws for cops to be able to arrest more people. But what we've seen is that most of the arrests that have been occurring have been for people who have no criminal record.
Mayormente gente que está siendo deportada en este momento no tenía ningún récord criminal. A través de no solamente las leyes que está creando, sino el discurso de
Behind these laws, and not only these laws,
hacia nuestra comunidad,
but the discourse of hate that these laws create create not only hate and criminalization to our community, but has a bigger impact because these laws are reviving the racism that people believe in. And our people are more vulnerable to be victims of these people who believe they're Minutemen or empowered to do the work of the law.
Hay muchos impactos negativos hacia la comunidad. El miedo, vivir con miedo.
There are many negative impacts to our community. Fear and living in fear every day, being worried of being separated from your loved ones or family members. This is something that our community lives with. And not just our community here, but immigrant communities across the country.
Y hay mucha gente que hoy en día dice, oh, son criminales porque vinieron aquí de una forma no legal, que arreglen sus papeles, que los pongan en
And many
regla.
people today
Pero
are saying
tengo que
that
contarles la historia
our community is criminal because they came in a form that wasn't to them legal. But I want to remind us of our history of the white communities that came without a legal pathway or permission to this land to colonize the land from native communities, not in the legal way, but they came with a force to take away other people's land.
En serio, ellos mataron mucha gente. Entonces, sabiendo esa historia,
And in reality, they killed many native people. And so knowing that history and saying that we are criminal for crossing a border when we are simply looking for better conditions to our lives feels very contradictory. And I just really want to be clear that I don't share that history as a way to share hate towards the white community, but more of just the facts of what happened.
Yeah, and clearly when politicians are talking about immigration in terms of an invasion, they're masking the deeper racist ideology that they're promoting. they're using different terms to sound like less hateful and really drive fear into already afraid white folks. Have you seen since the election an increase in clear like racial vigilantism from in around Western North Carolina against immigrants? Or even if you haven't, obviously it doesn't mean it doesn't exist or isn't going to happen, but I wonder if you've seen any examples that you could share.
Yo puedo pensar que a nivel local está dividido
I can think
entre
of,
personas
within a local
que son
context, how
amigos
this community
que
is
aman a la
divided
comunidad
by
latina
two groups of
y
people who are
amistades que
allies
no
and
se
love the
tenían,
immigrant
pero que hasta
community, and
ahora
the other side of
siempre
people
se
who
han
hate the immigrant
detenido de
community
hacer un
but have never
acompañamiento
taken a physical
físico,
violent action
aunque de
besides
palabras sí lo
words,
hay,
which verbal
ha
abuse
sido
is
mucho
something
más.
that their community does experience.
Y en estados vecinos como Sur Carolina,
And in
se ha
neighboring states like
pasado
South Carolina,
personas
there
que
have been cases
se
where
hacen pasar
citizens
por
are
agentes de
acting as
migración
if they
y
were
han
ICE
hecho
agents
actos en
and
contra de
began to
personas de la
terrorize
comunidad
members of the immigrant
migrante.
community.
I've witnessed many people sharing photographs of law enforcement around here, around Western North Carolina, or concerns that ICE is driving down the road or is conducting a raid. And that news has turned out so far to be unverified. Or I'd like you to speak about the presence of federal law enforcement that you and your organization are aware of so far, and how you deal with potential instances of immigration law enforcement in the area.
Claro, se ha visto un mayor
Of course, we have seen a large rise of policing in our area, especially by police undercover or state troopers that are undercover. And we receive a lot of reports of ICE in this area because they aren't wearing anything that can identify them as ICE.
identifique como agencia de migración o state troopers o sheriffs. Y con el presidente
And with the
y
president and
Hoffman
Tom
diciendo que
Hoffman
van a
saying that
deportar
they were
muchas
planning to
personas,
deport many
pues claro
people,
que el
it's
temor y
very
la
common that
confusión de
the
la
fear and
comunidad es grande.
anxiety is in the community.
But while it's realistic that the fear is in the community and that people be prepared, can you talk about how CIMA engages with, informs the community?
Bueno, nosotros creemos que
I
la
think
primera
the
defensa que la
first line of
comunidad
defense that our
tiene
community
es el
has is really
conocer sus
knowing your
derechos,
rights
el
and being
estar
vigilant of their
vigilantes
surroundings.
de
If you see a
actividades
suspicious car
sospechosas,
or not
no
opening the doors,
reconoces un carro,
not answering
parece
questions if being
policía,
questioned by the
no
police,
abrir tus
especially at your
puertas, no
workplace,
prestar
knowing
absolutamente
what our
nada
rights are
si,
and that we have the
si te
right to remain
cuestionan
silent
tu
if we're talking
nombre,
to a
si
local
llegan a tu
or a
trabajo
federal
y
agent.
preguntan quién eres, de dónde eres, porque tenemos derecho a guardar silencio. Claro, y esto no está solamente para la comunidad latina,
And of
sino
course,
para
this
la
is not just for
comunidad
the Latino
migrante
community,
de
but
donde
the
sea
immigrant
que
community
tú
from wherever you
vengas.
come from.
Independientemente de tu estatus
And
migratorio, tienes
most people
derechos.
may come and
Mucha
think
gente
that they
piensa
have
que
no
dices que no
rights,
los tienes
but all
porque
of us have rights
veniste
as
de
humans,
una
and we need
forma
to
no
learn how to use them.
aprobada, entre comillas, pero independientemente de eso, tú sigues siendo un ser humano que tienes derechos y que necesitas aprenderlos para poder usarlos. Bueno, después viene el cuidarnos entre vecinos,
And then
el
the second line of defense that I would
respetarnos,
share is
porque
that
como
within neighbors,
vecinos
we are able to
podemos
protect each other as
vernos
neighbors, get to
y
see each other, get to
cuidarnos
know
y
each other,
crear,
and
aunque
create
sea un
groups
grupito
of
en nuestros
communication within
vecindarios,
neighborhoods
como para
to
mirar si hay
share if
migración
ICE is present and
alrededor,
be able
para
to
sentirnos
watch the
seguros los unos
neighborhood.
de los
And that's
otros.
one way that we can feel safer.
Hay actualmente muchas organizaciones y aliados haciendo
And then the last level I would share is
iWatch.
that there is currently
Y
many
esto
organizations and
yo
allies
espero que sea
doing
a
what
nivel nacional
we
y
understand as
como
ICE
aliado que nos
Watch.
estás
And I
escuchando,
hope this
también
grows on a
puedes
national level
participar
so that anyone listening to this
viendo
who's a
si ves un
citizen, you
carro
listening to us
que no
now, can be a part
conoces
of this movement
o
to
un
watch
agente
ICE.
que
If you
crees
see a car you don't
o que tú
know,
puedes ver
if
visualmente que es
you see with your
pues
own eyes that
acostumbras a
ICE is
trabajo
in the
allí,
area
que
and you
sabes que
have
son
loved ones who
vulnerables
are
y tú puedes
undocumented
decirle,
or a part
hey,
of the immigrant
acuérdate que
community,
tienes
being able to
derecho a
share
guardar
with them
silencio y
that ICE is in the area and confirming it, and so that people can make the decisions to protect themselves.
This is the final straw on the Pacifica Network, and you're hearing Dulce from CIMA talking about solidarity with immigrant communities in Western North Carolina. More at cimawnc.org. Buncombe County, where Asheville is, has for a while had sheriffs that have not actively participated in detaining people for immigration holds. However, Henderson County, just south of us, does. Because some of the changes that the Trump administration have made have put responsibility for policing around immigration issues or the ability for federal law enforcement to act on behalf of ICE. Other organizations like Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, other organizations. I guess all the cars don't always look like ICE cars that could be stopping people and doing this kind of work. But at least my understanding is up until now, for a while in Buncombe, the local law enforcement has not been holding people for immigration purposes. Can you share about what you know of that and maybe how that came to be?
Bueno, el condado de Henderson actualmente.
Well, the Department of Hendersonville Police have already been in agreements with ICE. Besides HB 10, which is a statewide law, the Hendersonville Police Department has agreed to be a part of the 287G program, which is an agreement that says once someone enters the jail has the right to run through identity databases, to share the migratory status of the person they detained, so that ICE can know that they are there.
Sobre Buncombe, pues al final
And in Buncombe County, the Sheriff's Department has, at some point, they will have to follow the laws like HB 10, but currently it's a lot less likely that someone will be deported if you are arrested in Buncombe County compared to Henderson County.
A través de Buncombe que de Hendersonville. Y los efectos negativos que esto tiene.
And the negative effects that this has is that law enforcement is breaking the trust with the community, especially those who have been victims of crimes or victims of violence, because there isn't a trusted source to call for help.
Policíacas o del orden.
I guess, can you talk in more detail about if there's any other suggestions besides those immediate interventions against law enforcement that listeners who aren't already involved in some of these programs could start supporting folks that are in danger of raids and deportations?
Claro, yo creo que puedes, para quienes nos escuchan, acercarte.
Of course, I think in this time, especially for those who are listening, it's time to join an organization or to go and get more involved with the schools or to get more involved with a church in your area. Or simply if you have a coworker or a friend that you know is a vulnerable person in this time, you can offer them a ride to work or offer them a ride home.
Y menciono a la escuela porque con los nuevos cambios administrativos.
And I mention the schools because with the new administrative changes, places like schools and churches are not safe or sanctuary places like they once were. And so when ICE comes, those who are involved with the schools or churches need to be witnesses and be able to see that if ICE raids a school, that they're actually following the law and not making false arrests or arrests without an actual warrant. And so that ICE is not using a warrant that isn't signed by a judge and making arrests that are, at this point, like kidnapping.
También está el apoyo económico. A lo mejor no tienes el tiempo.
And there's also this way to support that's economic. Maybe you don't have to be involved in an organization or get closer to a church, but you could provide a small financial donation to support families going through those unexpected expenses. For example, having to meet with a lawyer for the first time or having fees that you didn't know you were going to have.
Que puedan ser cubiertos a través de esa ayuda económica que puedes dar. También apoyar a las
And I would also say to start joining your protests in your local community that are causing disruption. And of course, protests may be an inconvenience to a lot of people. They think that it's annoying or frustrating, but we need to disrupt because there are unjust actions against the immigrant community, a community that is not only providing an economic strength to the country, but also a labor force that is needed, a languages that are being shared, culture that is being shared and loved on by many people of the country that we've been open to share to other people, as well as food. Many people enjoy the food of immigrant communities and are in support of the immigrant community. And really, whatever skills you can provide, your abilities, your time, and simply being in a company, accompanying a family member or a friend who is going through this vulnerable time can make the biggest impact.
I'm reminded of the large demonstrations that have happened in the last week across the country, particularly demonstrations in Phoenix and Houston and Los Angeles and San Diego, and also calls for people to have one-day strikes and refuse to purchase or refuse to go to work in solidarity with communities facing deportations. These are similar to calls from the early 2000s, like 2005, 2006. There were massive demonstrations or boycott days in solidarity with immigrants. These events, are they inspirational?
Yo creo que es poderoso poder manifestarte.
I think it's powerful to join in large manifestations and protests, especially to show what you value and what your values are. And when they are threatening you constantly with separation of families and detentions, of course, you should have the right to use, you should feel the power to use your right to protest. And it's powerful to be able to say, I don't agree with this administration. I don't agree with these laws. And being outside to share that and vocalize that and manifest that can empower others to raise their voices and share what they believe is right.
Motiva a muchas más personas a salir y decir, yo tampoco estoy de acuerdo con esto. Y entonces sucede la magia de la solidaridad.
Do you have any resources that you would suggest for people to keep informed on the issues impacting their community members as pertains to deportations, criminalization, and solidarity?
Sí, YouTube.
Yes. So currently YouTube has so many videos of training yourself to know your rights. I think that's the fastest thing that comes to mind. And there's also apps to learn what your rights are.
Que dice, conoce tus derechos. Hay organizaciones a nivel nacional.
And there are organizations on a national level like the ACLU who are constantly sharing the constitutional rights of people. I would suggest getting closer to an organization that can help you know your rights if you ever come across an ICE agent or police. And we also have CIMA as a resource and our community hotline, which is 1-888-839-2839, which is a phone that you can call if you do see any sightings of ICE in our neighborhoods or if a family member has been detained by ICE.
And CIMA is on Instagram and Facebook, right? And you have a website that's was cimawnc.org,
yes.
I think. Thank you so much for having this conversation, and also thank you so much for the interpretation. I much appreciated you both taking time out of your very busy days to do this. And I hope that the audience gets a lot out of this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
I know the kind of pain you're feeling, Alex. I once had it myself.
You some kind of doctor?
No, Alex. I am Magneto, and I have come to offer you sanctuary.
Hello, this is our jingle for our podcast, The Grounded Futures Show.
This is the show where we discuss topics ranging from climate change to identity to how youth can gain new skills to thrive amid current and ongoing disasters that we are collectively facing. We are your hosts, one Gen Z Liam and one Gen X Carla. And we think we all deserve to thrive now and not in some distant utopian future.
Yeah, but that's in the future. Oh, I hate the future.
Yeah, we're with Bolin. Grounded Futures is a larger project, so check that out over at groundedfutures.com.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support.
I am here with Kristian Williams, author of The Illuminist, Philosophical Explorations in the Work of Alan Moore, and we're here to talk a little bit about the book today. Kristian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Can you introduce yourself and give readers some background on your work and your areas of focus?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my most recent book is The Illuminist, which is a collection of essays about Alan Moore. I've also written books considering the works and thoughts of George Orwell and Oscar Wilde. I'm probably better known for my other work, though, which is chiefly about policing and state violence. I suppose my most famous book is Our Enemies in Blue, Police and Power in America, which is a history of the police in the United States.
Thank you. Can you give readers who may be unfamiliar with the work of Alan Moore a little bit of background on his work?
Sure. Alan Moore is probably the most important comics creator of the last 50 years. He got his work writing for comics in the UK that were like sort of staples of 1970s British science fiction comics, but are probably not known to Americans. And then he rose to more of a mainstream position when he took over writing for Swamp Thing in the early 80s. At the time, Swamp Thing was basically a title that was dying. And I think because people hadn't been reading it, the powers that be at DC Comics didn't put much of a leash on Moore as he did his work. And what that meant was that he brought a much more mature, much more serious sensibility to the comic, and included adult themes, not just in the sense of like sex and violence, but in the sense of exploring human relationships, what it is that it means to belong to a community or be excluded from a community, some political concerns, some ecological concerns, really and also experimented with what the comics medium was capable of in a way that practically nobody was doing at the time, certainly not in a mainstream, for a mainstream company. After that, he went on to write Watchmen, which is probably his most famous work. And that, along with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, which came out at the same time, just completely upended the expectations of the superhero genre. Watchmen really took apart the tropes and motifs of the genre, examined them, and put them back together in a new way. And since that time, his work has really never stopped developing. He's written about, unfortunately, the things that most people know are the books that got made into movies, which is unfortunate because the movies generally aren't very good, whereas the books uniformly are. But some of the things that he wrote were From Hell, and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, V for Vendetta. And he's continuously explored new territory thematically, and also improved his technique for 40 years now. His most recent book is the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, written with his friend Steve Moore, which is a long and intimidating introduction to ritual magic.
Okay. Plenty of places to go from there. But what I would like to maybe circle back to a little bit and maybe highlight, especially for those readers who are not necessarily steeped in the world of comics as we are, can you say a little bit about the way he subverted the format and the structure of comics, especially in those early works that garnered him so much recognition? I know that it's kind of a big question because he did it in a lot of different ways across his career. But I mean, if you could, maybe get to the nuts and bolts of it, or the real basic
Sure.
piece of it.
Let me talk about Watchmen for a bit. So there are two things that I think two aspects to this. One is what he did specifically with the medium, and the other is what he did with the genre, the genre of superhero stories. In the medium, he did a lot of really remarkable work in terms of creating subtext that would not be apparent on the first read, and that there are small background details. It's really a very literary approach to a medium and genre that's not been treated particularly, with that seriousness. He especially tended to overlay several layers of narrative at the same time, often in a single panel, where there would be one set of events happening in the image, something related but perhaps different being expressed in the dialogue, and then yet a third thing being expressed in a caption box, which was usually referencing some other narrative that was embedded in the comic. Like, so for example, there is a character, Rorschach, who's a masked vigilante, and he keeps a journal, and so bits of his journal would show up in the caption box, which would either amplify or sometimes subvert what was being shown in the image. And that's a quality of storytelling that was very unusual at the time. It's pretty unusual even now. And I don't know that it had been tried before in such a sustained way, that it would run like that. You may have seen that show up in like a couple pages of a comic previously, but you weren't going to see 10 issues of it maintaining that same multi-layered narrative tension. In terms of the genre, I mean, he moved away from simplistic but charming Silver Age stories in which the superheroes were just unambiguously the good guys, the villains were unambiguously the bad guys, and the point of the story was to see how the good guys beat the bad guys. Morally, it's much more complex. It's not like a lot of the purported heroes are just sort of despicable people. Even the best of them are pretty psychologically damaged, I would say. The villains, in fact, turn out to be just, well, it's not clear who the villains are, actually. And because from a certain point of view, Ozymandias, who turns out to be the sort of person behind the conspiracy and plotting to bring about a attack on New York City, by his own lights, which we're given every opportunity to understand and possibly relate to, he's the hero, right?
Sure.
The book doesn't definitely contradict that. I mean, I think that there are elements to the story that makes Moore's position clear. However, it's not a didactic matter of delivering the moral. It's more a matter of posing this complicated moral question of, means and ends and the limits of utilitarianism, and then leaving it with the audience to consider, Ozymandias' position, also Moore's position, right? And for that matter, the position of all of the other cast of characters that appear in the comic. So there's much more moral complexity than was normal there, which I think fundamentally subverts the kind of notion of superheroes, at least complicates it enormously. And relatedly, Moore brings a political sensibility to the storytelling, such that he highlights the unsavory connections between this fantasy world of superheroes and our real world, in which the United States has a tradition of vigilantism, which is almost implacably racist. So he draws out by considering what superheroes would be like if they existed in the real world, and considering what the world would be like if it had such people in it, he exposes the right-wing tendencies that are implicit in the superhero narratives, and I think to a large degree subverts them.
Okay. I want to get into his legacy and the legacy of his storytelling a little bit down the line, but ahead of that, may I please ask you, on a personal note, can you talk a little bit about your history with the work of Alan Moore? Were you on board with this as it was coming out? And, when you kind of came to it, what was the stuff that just kind of hit you in the way that inspired such passion for the work?
I mean, I was a little bit late for the early stuff because I was a child in the 80s, and
Sure.
I remember seeing some of those Swamp Things when they came out and just kind of not understanding what was going on. I was looking for something more along the lines of the 1970s House of Mystery, and instead I had this like
drama
plant that may or may not be a man that is psychically traveling through space, and I was just like, I don't like this. Isn't for me, right?
Right.
But I guess in the early 90s, the first thing that I found was V for Vendetta, which spoke to me right away. And then, I think at that stage, I read V for Vendetta, I read Watchmen, I read From Hell when that came out, and I saw these as very well-made comics, but it didn't really occur to me that they had much to do with each other than that they were written by the same person, right? As time went on and I became, I hope, a more sophisticated reader, but also I just read a lot more of his stuff and also returned to those titles, repeatedly. I started to see more of the connections between them thematically and in terms of technique. And I realized that as much as all of the stories stand alone, they also were all different facets of a fairly coherent worldview. And that started, and it's one of those things where the more I looked at it, the deeper it seemed. And I'm not sure I've gotten to the bottom yet.
Sure. Now, I think that is a rarity for a writer to be able to put that much of their worldview on the page in such a, I don't want to say a succinct way, but I mean, it seems like he, from the beginning, has given readers a lot of breadcrumbs to follow up on. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of think that's the way to get people to look into things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think some of his work, he will just explain ideas. Like a lot of Promethea, which is this long exploration into sort of the idea of magic. A lot of that is just spent with various characters explaining, the tarot and the Kabbalah to the sort of new initiate, right? Obviously, a stand-in for the reader in that sense. But mostly what he does is he invites greater and greater curiosity. That he, rather than didactically just stating what he thinks, he creates a whole world to explore certain kinds of ideas. And while it's usually possible to discern where he stands on the important ethical or political questions, it's not like the position becomes inescapable from the work, or it's not like the position becomes like, if you don't accept his view of it, then the work becomes sort of useless. It's not it's not nearly that direct. It's instead more of inviting you into a conversation. And I think his purpose is to lead the reader to examine these things for themselves, taking into account what he said about it, but not sort of authoritatively declaring that as the end of as the final decision.
Can you talk a little bit about the origins of these essays that constitute the book? I seem to recall quite a few of them came from, or were initially published at least, at Hooded Utilitarian, a comic blog from the early 2000s.
Sure. They weren't written with a collection in mind, so there's necessarily a kind of fragmented aspect to the collection as a whole. And they were written over the course of a dozen or more years. Many of them did originally start at Hooded Utilitarian, which was a site run by Noah Berlatsky, which really attracted an impressive amount of critical talent. And I was lucky enough to contribute to for as long as it lasted. And one of the benefits of that sort of niche blog was that as long as it was broadly related to popular culture, especially comics, but also occasionally film, Noah would really just sort of like let you run with whatever seemed interesting. What he was really concerned about in curating the site was the quality of the work, as opposed to, maintaining a consistent voice or party line, or, it only being about things that have come out in the last 3 months, or any of the other stuff that hampers some of the other, some other publications. And so usually what happened was some aspect of a piece, an aspect of one or more's comics would trigger something in me, trigger a curiosity. And as I followed it up, I would realize that there was, often, the more I looked into it, the more it seemed like there was to look into. And as often, just as a matter of systematizing my own thinking, I would end up writing about it and doing increased research. And at some point, some portion of the time, I realized that, this may actually interest other people besides just me. And so a lot of the essays started with just some idea, some image, some line of text, getting its claws into me and just not letting go. And I would circle around that thought for, weeks or months, and develop it into a kind of a project on its own.
Now, if I recall correctly, Moore has described himself as an anarchist, or at least leaning towards anarchism in the way he kind of views the world. Would you say it's fair to qualify his body of work as anarchistic in general, or would you say that it more lends itself to an anarchistic interpretation?
Well, you do recall correctly. He has stated a number of times fairly directly that his politics are anarchist. He's a little soft-spoken about it, right? It's not like a thing that he's hiding, certainly, but it's also not it's not usually the thing he starts with, right? Now, and I would say that shows up in the work in a number of places. Some of it being specifically the plot of V for Vendetta. And the V gives a couple, sort of great speeches about the nature of anarchy, etc. But also it shows up in the questioning of authority and the questioning of the nature of power and what legitimizes it in really all of his work, but maybe most famously in Watchmen. And then it shows up in the sort of celebration of beauty and freedom and the freedom of the imagination and sexual liberation in works like Lost Girls, which is this a comic which is literally pornography and also high art. Now, again, let's see how to express this exactly. One of the maybe most anarchistic things about his work is that it doesn't take a position of just authoritatively laying down a line, and instead invites the reader into a kind of project of co-creation of the meaning of the work. That, the interpretation, of course, should relate to the text, but there's also enough ambiguity, there's enough uncertainty, there's enough nuance that the reader also has to do the work of figuring out what this thing means. And that there's going to be a range of meanings that are all sort of in the area of correct, right? In that sense, he requires the reader to take responsibility for the meaning that we find in the work, rather than relying on the authority of the author to delineate what the work means.
And that would be that, to interrupt you, that would be the invitation to conversation you referred to earlier.
Yes, exactly. And and occasionally he, in the work, is explicit about the fact that he is doing this. I mean, the Watchmen ends with this image of a hand reaching for a book, and the caption is something along the lines of, I leave the matter entirely in your hands, right? Now, that has a particular meaning in the course of the plot, but it's also pretty clearly a message from the author to the audience that, understanding the narrative that he's given us is very much up to us. That the what meaning we take from it is going to partly be determined by the concerns and the values and the interpretive strategy that the readers bring to it.
So, over the course of these dozen years in which you have read, and longer for your reading, but in which you have written about it, how has your conception of Moore and his, I don't want to say goals, but I guess his concerns changed over the years?
Well, again, at the beginning, I think that I mostly just understood these as very well-made genre stories, right? The Watchmen was just an unusually sophisticated superhero story, that V for Vendetta was sort of a pulp adventure with anarchist politics, that, From Hell was sort of a horror narrative that had just happened to be exhaustively historically researched. But over time, I started to realize that there were genuine philosophical questions that were being raised by this, and that in terms of politics, in terms of ethics, in terms of metaphysics, in terms of epistemology, like all four of the main philosophical areas, and that there were, and I started recognizing themes that were recurring throughout the work, and also sort of different approaches to questions like, how should we organize society, and what is what determines right versus wrong, and how do we know that the world is the way that it seems to us? Those questions became okay. So one direction that my reading of this developed is that those questions became at least as interesting to me as the plot. The other is that I learned to recognize more and more the technical, Moore's technique in conveying his meaning, and the innovative things he did in terms of plot and character and dialogue and that sort of stuff, but also in the interaction between the words and the images, and the ways different images on the same page relate. And in terms of a later Promethea issue, there's a really interesting experiment where if you took the pages apart, you can assemble them all into one single image. And, that's just, I don't think that's ever been done in comics before or probably since. And so I became more appreciative of the aesthetic and the technical qualities as well.
In terms of that last example, especially, it kind of flies completely in the face of comics culture in that comics culture kind of wants you to hold things in this dear way and kind of keeping it mint and, keeping it intact. And, he's explicitly encouraging, in a way, the destruction of the comic book in order to make something bigger. And I think that kind of gets to the way that he has played with the format and the structure throughout his career.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I mean, there's a whole metaphor in that contained in the idea of cutting apart the comic in order to assemble it into a greater work of art. And yeah, that relates very well to his technique for sort of reappraising the superhero genre. It also relates very clearly to the very beginning of his run on Swamp Thing, which begins with the main character on an autopsy slab and a scientist cutting him apart and explaining how this character, as it's been understood up to this point, just makes no sense at all, right?
Sure.
And so Moore, throughout his career, is regularly taking apart the genres that he's working in and then putting them back together in some new way, which lets us see how these stories work, why the characters are the way they are, and lets us consider why these things are meaningful to us.
Now, you've touched upon a few times the information he conveys visually. Readers who look into it will, if you can pretty easily find some of his script pages floating around online, and they are far, far more detailed than anything you'll see generally in the comics medium. That semiotic aspect, and I guess also by extension the esoteric aspect, do you think that is, I mean, that was certainly ahead of its time, but do you think that it's kind of uniquely appropriate to the time we're in? I mean, I feel like people are much more receptive to the esoteric today than they were, say, 20 years ago.
Yes. So one of the themes that recurs throughout Moore's work is that of the end of the world. And in some of the stories, it seems like in Watchmen, there is the danger of actual nuclear apocalypse. And in other stories, it's much more a spiritual or even psychological event. And what he really is getting at, I think, is that the end of one kind of governing narrative of how we understand our lives, how we organize our society, the kind of story that the whole culture tells to itself in order to make life make sense. And I think we're at a point where the dominant culture of the last period of sort of endless capitalist expansion and representative democracy is clearly in some state of collapse. And there's this question of, I don't think it's usually put this way, but there's this question of what the new story that comes out of that is going to be. And I think that means that people are looking in a lot of different places for a way of
replacing the world into a context.
Yeah, of rediscovering meaning in the world, of being able to make some sense of it. And so, it's maybe not surprising in that context that there's, increasing interest in the occult and conspiracies and UFOs and, all of that sort of stuff, which, is usually marginal or relegated to simply a kind of entertainment in the mainstream culture, but was increasingly crowding in to the culture as a whole. And I think, we're seeing that in some benign or arguably beneficial ways. And then we're also seeing that in some like extremely destructive and reactionary ways. I think that means that aspect of Moore's work is receiving more attention and is also becoming more overt than it had been in the past. And it also means that he is at greater pains to warn against the kind of paranoid and reactionary versions of that.
So the point that jumped out at me from your book over and over again was just what you just said, and that is, let me see if I can phrase this correctly. One insight that really struck me as particularly in keeping with my conception of anarchism was the notion of good and evil as parts of a whole. On the theoretical level, I find that heartening. When the rubber meets the road, it means finding common cause with people outside of, our little anarchist bubble. I think that my experience with anarchists and anarchist organizing is such that there's an ability there that I don't see elsewhere to take a longer view and to know that these small actions, however menial they may seem, can add up to something greater and can accrue momentum. From the standpoint of Moore's body of work, not to be too reductive, but if you were to give Watchmen or Swamp Thing or, any of his works to an anarchist who was unfamiliar with that, what would you want them to have an eye towards? And I guess maybe conversely, and maybe this is a separate conversation entirely, what do you think non-anarchists can learn from anarchism in Moore's work?
Okay, there's a lot there. Let me start with what I think anarchists can take from it. I think one of the things that seems powerful to his work to me is the emphasis it places on the imagination. And politically, I think that's important, not just in the sense of being able to conceive of things being better, which of course that's vital, but also that the imagination itself is almost like a terrain of struggle, that the kinds of stories that people tell, the places that they find meaning, the ideals that they construct, like the sources of values, all of those things to some degree begin as these imaginary projects. And they have a real influence on the way people make sense of their lives and therefore what they do, right? And what seems important and what seems worth pursuing. Also in terms of like their lives personally, what seems admirable or what seems despicable, what seems like we should develop it in ourselves, and what seems like it's a thing to be cautious of and that we need to be managed, right? Like all of that to some degree, that's work that happens at least partly in the imagination before it gets played out in sort of material reality. And so in terms of what non-anarchists take from the work, he doesn't generally deliver a lot of sermons about politics and what he wants to see happen in society. I mean, he does do that occasionally, but it's not his. It's notable when he does it because it happens relatively rarely. And instead, what he does is he tells these stories, he creates these characters, and sets up these scenarios, which draw into question, things like who has the right to exercise power, and how do we determine who belongs in a community and who is excluded, and what is the relationship between good and evil in ourselves and within society, right? And I think again there's this sense of inviting people into a conversation, and his work is compelling enough and sophisticated enough that it doesn't just sort of reaffirm positions that are familiar, it opens up new ways of understanding things, new ways of thinking about it. It helps people expand the range of possibilities that they may consider. And so I don't think it's not like it's going to provide sort of the anarchist equivalent of a Sunday school lesson for non-anarchists, right? It's not going to like make the case for anarchism, but it may, by drawing them into that process of consideration and opening up these possibilities and in a way sort of expanding the freedom of the imagination, it may help lead non-anarchists toward sort of anarchist ways of thinking. Not necessarily anarchist ideas, but more anarchist processes, right? Yeah, did that cover everything, or is there something you want?
Yeah, that absolutely answers my question for sure. One question that I kind of would like to circle back to, just because I think that it sort of highlights Moore's, I guess, maybe personal trajectory. I think it's worth noting that he does not write comic books anymore. Mm-hmm. He has focused his time on short stories and essays and I believe theater production and novels. And I wonder if you could maybe opine a little bit on whether you think that he outgrew the medium, outgrew the audience. Is it some, other thing? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, I think, okay, so this is probably a little overdetermined because there were a lot of things happening at the same time, which I think he had several different kinds of frustration with comics. And probably the place where he talks about this most directly is, interestingly, not a comic, but it's in a short story collection, but in anybody else's hands, this would be a standalone novel because it's like 250 pages long. So let's split the difference and call it a novella called What We Can Know About Thunderman, which is in his book Illuminations. And one of the major frustrations that he has is with the industry itself, and that it is largely controlled by two big companies. They have a undecorous habit of swallowing up smaller companies and then ruining them. And that they have increasingly taken an approach to the medium, which then becomes sort of hegemonic, where the point is not to make good and compelling comic stories, right? But is instead to, first of all, create intellectual properties that can then be transferred to cinema or television. And so, the purpose of writing a story about a genius billionaire who makes a rocket suit isn't to make an entertaining story about that exactly. It's instead to kind of audition the property for what would then become the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? And so he feels like that has, he said explicitly that that's had a degrading effect on the quality of work within comics, and superhero genre especially. Relatedly, the comics industry has for its entire existence treated its talent terribly. At one point, he compares it to the attitude that a mining company has to a strip mine, right? The idea is to dig out all of the value that's here and then move on to the next thing you can dig all the value out of, rather than seeing that comics creators are also human beings and that talent may be unique. There may not be just another Steve Ditko around the next corner waiting for you to exploit him just as ruthlessly until he's exhausted, right? And Moore was an early advocate for the creators' rights movement, which is about as close as the freelance comic industry has ever gotten to the labor movement, and has been frustrated by his treatment, especially at the hands of DC Comics, going back decades. I mean, that's a grudge that he will surely hold until he dies. So there's both of those things. And then thirdly, I think he has been self-critical and frustrated at the effect that Watchmen and some of the other things that he was working on in that era had on the genre that he was working in, and that he was trying to make this politically and morally sophisticated story that also highlighted the technical potential of the medium. And what it seems like most creators and then also most audiences took from that is that it was okay to make comics like much more violent and put sex in them, right? And that we got the sort of grim and gritty or grim dark 90s coming out of that, where it seemed like the main effect of Watchmen was for comics to be nastier,
edgelord stuff.
Yeah, which is just the opposite of what he had hoped for. There's a frustration of being misunderstood or misapplied in that way, which I think over a very long time led him to be less and less interested in working in that medium and for that audience.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really enjoyed the book quite a lot.
Oh, thank you. And again, thanks for the invitation. It was great talking to you.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
The ethnic cleansing committed against the Palestinian people is the single greatest crime against humanity waged in our time. With Gaza reduced to rubble moonscape and a kind of agreement brokered for the return of hostages, it appeared the madness was almost at an end. Then we entered the golden age of America. Elon Musk and 6 of his frat bros at the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't even really a thing, seized control of U.S. aid offices, and in their cuts to unnecessary government spending, reported that they stopped hundreds of millions of dollars in condoms from being delivered to Gaza. Hundreds of millions of dollars in condoms being delivered to Gaza. Now, I didn't do the math on this, but someone calculated that at the standard cost of a condom, and with 2 million people in Gaza, this would come out to thousands of condoms for every man, woman, and child. It seems totally preposterous on the face of it that 2 million starving people who need water and medicine would get deliveries of condoms, except that I'm too familiar with how the U.S. operates, and so it seems plausible to me that the U.S. would, in fact, airdrop hundreds of giant crates of ribbed French ticklers onto the Palestinian people. But, alas, no. After the White House had already repeated the story hundreds of millions of dollars in condoms earmarked for Gaza, somebody did a deeper dive and discovered, first, the funding wasn't just for condoms, but was for medical care and contraception. And second, it wasn't going to the Gaza Strip, but it was going to a delivery point on the continent of Africa, a city called Gaza. So Elon Musk didn't scrap condom deliveries to Palestinians. He scrapped a medical program that benefited all of Africa. The hundreds of millions of dollars in condoms getting dropped on Palestine was never a thing. But that didn't stop the Orange Cheeto-in-Chief from talking about it. Trump doubled down at a press conference, claiming that not only was a multi-million-dollar airdrop of condoms into the Gaza Strip recently scrapped, but that Hamas had been making bombs out of condoms. Bombs out of condoms. Imagine that. Imagine you're an IDF military commander partying it up at a Tel Aviv nightclub, and you purchase a condom from a sketchy machine in the bathroom. You don't closely check the packaging. Later you slip it on, and the genital friction gets to happening, and then boom! You're peeing through a tube that comes out of your belly button for the rest of your life. Condom bombs. How insidious. But they never happened. Trump made them up. So now we fast forward to Tuesday. On Tuesday, Donald Trump and Benny Netanyahu met for a couple hours, twisting heads off of puppies and driving nails through the skulls of live kittens. And in the press conference that followed, Trump announced that the U.S. is going to take over the Gaza Strip. Own it. The plan is to get rid of the Palestinians and then rebuild Gaza to be a new Riviera. A new Riviera. Sounds like hotels and casinos, right? Well, check this out. Previously in his career, Donald Trump made a prior comparison to a new Riviera. He used that very phrase to describe his own casino in Atlantic City. By the way, this is the only casino in the history of ever that lost money. It was so terrible, Trump filed bankruptcy. He's the only guy who ever lived who failed to make money by running a gambling racket. There are literally bookies in prison who make more money off of NFL gambling tickets than Trump made off of a casino in Atlantic City that he compared to the new Riviera. Given Trump's track record here, the Palestinian people who currently live in a crumbling and condemned dump will soon be living in a crumbling and condemned dump with Trump's name in gold letters over the door. Gaza might soon become the 51st state, unless the U.S. invades Greenland and Panama first, in which case Gaza will be the 53rd state. The problem is everyone talks about the territory and not the people. It's as if the Palestinian people don't exist, like they're already erased, removed from the calculus. I'm reminded of the Zapatista slogan, spoken by others being pushed out of existence. They said, "We are already dead." That kind of feels like what it is to be Palestinian. I remember more than 20 years ago, a Republican from Texas on the Foreign Relations Committee, Representative Dick Armey, summed up the situation in Palestine by saying that the Israelis had more guns and more people, so they won. Dick Armey suggested that the Palestinians needed to get armed and find a place they could invade and conquer. I don't know, but I think Dick Armey was onto something, even though his name conjures a vivid visual of marching palaces. Might does make right. The Palestinians need to find a chunk of real estate they can invade and conquer and colonize. Perhaps everyone with empathy for the Palestinians should fundraise for guns and ammunition and PT boats. We can get the Palestinians trained for an amphibian. And I think I found the perfect point of attack. Palestine, Texas. Palestine, Texas is in Dick Armey's old district. I bet 2 million armed Palestinians could storm the beach and get a foothold, repel the Texas National Guard, and then call in international peacekeeping forces to help establish a border for their new nation. And the weather is roughly the same, and it's mostly dry desert surrounding it, and it's already called Palestine, like it was built and just waiting for them to invade and conquer. This is what the United States expects, right? The Palestinians getting out of the way and finding their own place else. Assuming everything went according to my plan, the U.S. would have a 53rd state, and the Palestinian people would have a nice chunk of Texas. Of course, Trump would need to sign another executive order. Recall, he changed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. He'd now have to change to the Gulf of Palestine. And if he were forced to do that, at least there would be some small justice in the world. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the super duper uber mega ultra hyper turbo multi maxi max in Youngstown, Ohio, just 25 miles from East Palestine. If you're plotting places the Palestinians can invade and conquer and live in peace, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243 63205 OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.